crowded financial sector. It's a phony crisis. They don't have to be cuts. We know how to get out of a Great Depression. You spend money. If we take a look at the typical worker, they're not doing fine. Hi, I'm Dean Baker, the host of Mostly Economics, and I have with me today Adam Gaffney, who's an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School and also a past head of the Physicians for a National Healthcare Program. And they're best known for being the leading proponents of Medicare for All. And I'll just say at the beginning, I've been a fan of Medicare for All for a long time. In fact, I've been a fan of it so long it was known as single payer. But I was very hesitant about the idea in recent years because I thought if we're going to do it, we'd get there eventually. We'd have to do it piecemeal. And ironically, with Trump era, I think we actually could think big things, like we might be able to do it not tomorrow, but in a more narrow time frame. And that's why I was so happy to have Adam on. He's worked on this issue for years. And I thought it'd be great to talk a little bit about Medicare. I was going to say single payer. Medicare for All, what would be involved, and how we could talk about getting there. So welcome, Adam.
Thanks so much for having me, Dean. This is great.
So Adam, if I could, start out by, if you could just sort of outline, what you envision. Obviously, there's lots of bells and whistles that we'd have to, we won't get to all of them, but, lots of things that you could talk about and what a Medicare for All system looks like. But what do you see as the main features of it? And, maybe tell us what, if there's a country you think that we should look to as the best model.
Sure. I mean, look, the very basic concept of Medicare for All, single payer, also known as national health insurance, these terms mean the same, is very simple. You cover everyone in a country with a single public insurance program. The way things stand now, we all are covered or not covered by different programs. Medicaid for lower income individuals, Medicare for older individuals, private insurance for most people who get insurance through the job. And all these different insurers take money either from our wallets or through taxes and then pay money out to the providers of care. This creates enormous inefficiencies, massive waste, huge fragmentation, administrative bloat, and worst of all, people do very poorly in this country from the perspective of healthcare outcomes. We, leave 8 million people uninsured, 8% of the population uninsured, nearly 30 million, more underinsured. We have high rates of so-called healthcare amenable mortality, meaning deaths that are potentially preventable through healthcare. So a Medicare for All system is simple. It enrolls everyone in the country, one public program. It saves a lot of money by doing that, and it also can achieve better outcomes.
Let me ask one of the points, I think for all of us, anyone's had occasion to deal with the healthcare system, with better or worse, most of us do at time to time. It's invariably, and I've been fortunate, I have good insurance, I'm sure way better than most people, but it's still a morass. The problems you have to go through having things covered. Again, my wife's had health issues. I've had very few, but I would say probably half the time I've had to go to a doctor. I once had physical therapy. Again, I've been very fortunate. I haven't had big surgeries, no major expenses, but probably half the time I've had some problem in getting covered. And again, I'm not asking for anything that's debatable. I'm not having cosmetic surgery. And it's just the sort of thing that, again, I'm saying this as someone who, two things. One, I recognize my insurance is better than, probably 90%. I don't know, most people, I'll just say that. But the other thing is, I'm a PhD economist. I deal with forms. I deal with numbers. And it's a pain for me. And I think about someone, and people who are sick tend to have issues. People who need healthcare tend to be in bad health, and they have issues. And I just think about what it must be like for, let's say, someone in their 80s, having to deal with these forms, and they getting turned down because it doesn't cost an insurer anything to turn you down. Just say no. Maybe it's 100% right, but that you should get covered, but it costs you nothing to turn you down. And, I just think about that. That's just this incredible, obviously it's harassment and, at a time when people least need it, but just a waste. I mean, you have to deal with all, from both the person's standpoint and the insurers.
Right. And so, and there's two sides of that coin. I mean, one is the harm that's done, and two is the money wasted. The fact is the kind of barriers you're discussing are part of the basic business model of the private health insurance industry. So what to you is a huge waste of time and potentially something that might prevent you from getting care you need, for them is saved money, because we know that many people, when they get claims denied, won't pursue it further. Many people just won't get the care. And so that's the reality of the system right now. And that explains why there's been such such evident anger at private insurance companies in the system that we have right now. And look, when we talk about some of the waste in the system, this is part of that story. If you look at the overhead, the administrative overhead of private health insurers, depending upon what figure you look at, definitely over 10%. And why is that? Why are they taking 10% of your total premium just for their administrative processes? Why is that? And that's because they do these things. They have shareholders they need to pay. They have high executive salaries. They have giant apparatuses designed to push back both to patients and providers, on claims. They have marketing. They have advertising. And so that all of those functions generates huge amounts of wastes. And that's in contrast to the traditional Medicare system, which we need to distinguish from Medicare Advantage. The traditional Medicare system, where the overhead is typically around 2% in an average year. And that 2% versus, say, 12% difference may not sound like that much, but when you consider that the total healthcare spending is on the order of $4 trillion, you're talking about an enormous piece of money. But I do think centering it around patients, as you've done, is more important than just the dollars and cents. These are people who are not getting care they need and who are struggling to, have other important things they want to do in their life than be on the phone all day with an insurance company. A study recently found that administrative barriers, might deter about a quarter of Americans from getting needed care. And that's different than cost barriers, which we can talk about separately. So absolutely, this is part of the model of the current system. It doesn't have to be. It generates waste and it harms health.
Yeah, no, it's something that just can't be emphasized enough. And again, the 2% administrative cost for Medicare, it drove me nuts. I'm sure you even more so when Elon Musk with his Doge, Department of Governmental Efficiency team, yelling about government waste, and he's going on about this and that target-rich environment. And you go, okay, well, the two biggest programs in the government are Social Security and Medicare, and both of them are incredibly efficient. And it's Medicare. I mean, Social Security. I should say, I'm not going to downgrade forever on Social Security. I'm never going to say a bad word about it. But Medicare, 2% administrative costs. I think actually a little less if you look at the latest numbers. We don't have to go there. But that's huge compared to private insurers. And the other part, some of your colleagues I know have written several pieces, look at the administrative cost imposed on providers. And we've all seen this. You go into a doctor's office, you go into a hospital, they have a team of people dealing with insurance forms. And if we had, universal Medicare, there'd be a standard form. They'd be, okay, this is covered, that is whatever. I mean, it'd be standard. They wouldn't have to go, well, we don't think your insurance covers this. It only pays 50% or, again, I forget their estimates. I think that was somewhere around 10%. Was it that high? Do you recall?
Yes, I do. So for hospitals in the United States, about a quarter, this is, close colleagues of mine, Drs. Himmelstein and Wohlhandler, who co-founded PNHP. They found in a study some number of years ago that about a quarter, so this is the provider side administration, just to repeat that. And, just to explain why that is, as Dean, as you said, the hospitals need basically armies of billers and coders, both to tabulate per patient bills and also to negotiate and interact with for insurance companies, each of which has their own rules and regulations and requirements and so on and so forth. So this is a sort of industry in and of itself. But to cut to the numbers, about 1/4 of U.S. healthcare spend, U.S. hospital revenue goes to administration. That's double the percentage of Canadian hospitals. I'm not talking about total spending because we have lower spending. I'm saying as a percentage of total hospital revenue, we have double the revenue going towards administration. When you look at doctors' offices, a similar story. A somewhat dated study found that we spend about $80,000 per physician to cover the costs of their interactions with insurance companies. And that's about fourfold higher than the expenditures per physician in Canada. So this is playing out throughout the healthcare sort of ecosystem. And it's why the Congressional Budget Office, nonpartisan organization, found hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars potentially just from administration through a single payer transition.
I just want to emphasize the point about the administrative costs, because again, we don't have to get a technical argument about what the correct denominator is, but I want people to understand the difference. So you were saying that we spend twice as much as a share of our healthcare costs as Canada. So we take
for hospitals. I was talking about hospitals. Yeah.
So our healthcare costs are roughly twice. We don't have to get that exact. Our healthcare costs are roughly twice as high per person as they are in Canada. So that means we spend 4 times as much. So again, these aren't exact numbers, and we can argue what the correct denominator is. But the point is, if we say, okay, how much am I, Dean Baker, spending on administrative costs as an average person relative to the average person in Canada? The answer to that is 4 times as much. And again, part of that is healthcare costs more, so perhaps administrative costs would rise in proportion to healthcare costs. That's, again, we could argue whether that's true or not. But the fact of the matter is it's 4 times as much. That's a really big deal.
Yep. And that's just, again, we're talking that's hospital, physicians, nursing homes, and then the biggest one, which is the insurance side itself. And that's not only private insurance, it's also Medicare Advantage, and managed care Medicaid. So even our 2 public insurers, Medicaid and Medicare, have been increasingly taken over by private insurance companies. And the same problems that exist in the sort of regular private insurance also exist in the privatized version of our public payers. And actually it gives you a very clean apples to apples comparison. Anytime people dispute the sort of Medicare, is it really that different, the administrative costs of Medicare or private insurance? Well, you can present the figures for Medicare traditional, purely public, versus Medicare Advantage, privatized managed care. And it's exactly the same. I mean, if anything, managed care, Medicaid, Medicare administrative costs are just as high as any other private insurer, if not higher. And that, you're right. I mean, if Doge and Elon Musk wanted to actually go for actual waste, if they really were serious about this, which they are not, they could go after Medicare Advantage, which is now covering more than half of people 65 and older, and is an enormous waste of money, overpayments that huge amounts of money that could be saved by transitioning to a fully public program.
Yeah, I don't want to get too sidetracked on Medicare Advantage, but I think the point here is incredibly important just because it has grown so much, largely off the radar screen. I mean, people are signing up for it, so they know what they're signing up for. But I think a lot of, in political debates, it just hasn't gotten anywhere near the attention it should. And I generally don't even have a TV now, but I remember a while back I had TV, I was watching cable news, and probably half the ads were for Medicare Advantage. I saw Joe Namath come up. Everyone knows what Joe Namath is, but when I was growing up, he's a great quarterback, and it was sort of sad to see him on pushing a Medicare Advantage ad. It's good. Medicare.
It's where great. The big money is now. I mean, that's where the private insurers are making most of their revenue. It's no longer traditional private insurance; it's Medicare Advantage, and that's Dr. Oz. I mean, talking about people who are selling private. Dr. Oz himself was a Medicare Advantage sales person on his misinformation.
It's really sleazy how they push this because they've deliberately made the Medicare program inferior in ways that, just are unnecessary. So for the longest time, of course, they didn't cover drugs. Now they cover drugs through Part D, but they didn't cover drugs. It was set up 60 years ago. I have fun with people asking, not random people on the street, but fellow economists, why they didn't cover drugs when they set up Medicare. Simple answer, they didn't cost anything. So if you go back to 65, when they set up Medicare, cover drugs, so they said, well, you want us to pay for your aspirin? I mean, it might be nice, but, again, obviously a very poor person, aspirin's expensive. Most people could pay for their aspirin, but that was what drugs were then, whereas today they're very expensive, of course. So you need, anyhow, so Medicare Advantage will include a drug benefit, which thankfully they now have in Medicare. Again, it's a mess, way more administrative costs than need be. Covers hearing. Again, you go back, 60 years, hearing aids, most people didn't have them. They weren't that expensive. They're expensive now. Vision, same story. Dental care. Oh, and also this is, again, it just drives me nuts. There's no out-of-pocket maximum for traditional Medicare. So you're liable for 20% of the cost. And, up to whatever, if you have, a serious operation in a hospital, that could be $300,000-$400,000. You're liable for 20% of that. Who could afford that? So most people have to get supplemental insurance, if they can afford it. If they can't, they're out of luck. But with Medicare Advantage plans, they'll have caps. In fact, they're required to. Is it 7,000? It's something like that. There's an out-of-pocket cap, which is great, except that the problem with the Medicare Advantage is that they tend to have very thin networks. So you need to see a specialist, you need to see a cardiologist, you need to see a cancer. You might wait 6 months, a year, and if you're 80 and in bad health, that's kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
Anyhow,
and I think that's a critical point too, because again, not to belabor the Medicare Advantage issue, but first off, because we use the term Medicare for all, and I don't actually know when that first emerged. You said it used to be called single payer. But regardless, it's a little bit of a misnomer because, as you say, Medicare has significant problems and shortcomings and holes in coverage, even the traditional variety. Part of that was because when they implemented it, they sort of borrowed on some private insurance concepts, like the deductible. Co-insurance, and in contrast to what other European countries were doing, or even Canada around the same time, where care was fully covered or mostly fully covered. So you do need to fix traditional Medicare. There are those problems, the appealing elements of Medicare Advantage in terms of the lower cost sharing are there. And what that means is that we're segmenting sort of our seniors, right? Because basically, and on average, lower income people gravitate towards Medicare Advantage because of some of these real issues. But then that means they can't go to the same doctors. And part of the very concept in hospitals, and part of the very concept of something like Medicare for all, and to some extent, this is true of original Medicare, is it's a degree of equality. For all people, we should have access to the same doctors and hospitals. We shouldn't be confined, poor people to this one and rich people there. And once you start segmenting the sort of system into these strata, you get what is happening now with Medicare Advantage, and it's what you wouldn't have under a single payer system where we all have access to the full spectrum of doctors and providers. And this really matters when you get sick. When you're healthy, people are not aware of these issues when they're healthy. Maybe they need to switch a primary care doctor because their insurance changes, and that's bad. But if you have a lot of medical illnesses, if you have a lot of chronic conditions, it can actually be dangerous or even life-threatening to have your entire set of doctors suddenly go out of network, have the pharmaceuticals that you rely on suddenly switch formularies. And so it's a real problem.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Again, it's one of the things, obviously, people who, policy people, we all know this, but, for people on the street, they have no reason to think about this. But the insurers love to insure healthy people for an obvious reason. You don't cost them anything. So, you see a doctor once a year for a checkup or something, maybe an occasional x-ray. You don't cost them anything. So they're very happy to insure you. But if you have a serious illness, if you have a heart condition, if you have cancer, well, they really don't want to insure you. So on the one hand, you have the case, we denied your bill, go appeal it. Maybe at the end of the day, we'll appeal, we'll pay it, but maybe you'll drop it because, you're tired, you're in bad health. That's why you have this, but they ideally don't even want to insure people in bad health. And they do their best to try and avoid insuring those in bad health. And that was one of the things, we could argue whether the Affordable Care Act, how good it is. But I think it was a great improvement that it does at least it legally prohibits them from turning someone down or charging a higher fee based on their health. But again, these people are smart. They figure out ways to, try and weed out. And certainly Medicare Advantage, the classic story is you have a Medicare Advantage plan that gives you a free gym membership. Well, if you're already in really bad health, odds are you don't want a free gym membership. So the people who will sign up for that Medicare Advantage plan because you get a free gym membership, well, those are almost by definition people in better health. And right. That's exactly what the insurers are trying to do. They want to insure people that aren't going to have claims.
Exactly. And the studies have borne that out for Medicare Advantage again and again. Sicker people leave Medicare Advantage and go back to traditional Medicare. people with dementia, other serious conditions. And people in Medicare Advantage get less care on average. They get less home care visits. They get less doctor visits. So that segmentation is happening. And it's actually one of the big drivers of the overpayments to Medicare Advantage, favorable selection. The other one is upcoding. They're more aggressively, so they kind of look for healthier patients, but then they also make you look as sick as possible on paper, because that's what drives their payments, their capitated payments. And, putting aside Medicare Advantage, this is an argument for Medicare for all more generally, right? Because it shows the failure in keeping the private insurance as part of the picture. This is their business model. This is what they do. The regulators keep chasing them. It's a game of cat and mouse, and they keep coming out ahead. And so I think it's time to sort of put an end to the silliness and just have a system, again, that covers everyone, because they're going to keep doing this no matter how much you try to catch up.
This is one of the things I love, having fun with the anti-government people on this. They go, government can't do anything right. Look at the post office. Actually, most people like the post office these days. But if you go back 30 years ago, they thought the post office was horrible. So I was always, you want the post office giving you your health care. But you go, okay, fine. We don't think the government can do anything right. So here you have, Medicare Advantage, or, really any issue with insurers. Who do we think comes out ahead? We have the dumb bureaucrats. I'm being facetious because most of them aren't dumb and they work hard. But in any case, their story is the dumb bureaucrats. And then we have the whiz kids over at the insurance companies. And the whiz kids at the insurance companies are trying to devise all these ways to make a healthy person look really ill so that they can charge the government lots of money. Who wins in that story? And, again, it's not quite that bad because the government, the government bureaucrats do know what they're doing. But nonetheless, the insurers do manage to rip them off because they're the ones who directly have the information. They have the patient in front of them. So they could say X, Y, and Z about the patient. Government could, the oversight could try to look at that. They can't look at everything. So naturally, the insurers win out. They end up with upcoding these people, indicating that they're worse health than is in fact the case. And they get a larger payment from Medicare, or just more generally. That's the way they make money, and they're good at it.
And I think that, to your point about, the kind of perspective of the government can't do anything right. I mean, look, there are government programs that function poorly, and there are government programs that work very well. And in healthcare, certainly we've seen traditional Medicare outperform in terms of efficiency compared to the private sector. But I think it's important to bring up in this discussion as well the Veterans Health Administration. Kind of a bad sort of like historical reputation from movies like Born on the 4th of July, but that's really not the reality. Certainly not today. I mean, studies show that the quality of care delivered in VA hospitals is, if anything, higher than in the private sector. One of the areas that it gets dinged the most is waiting times. But researchers recently were able to actually look at this question using high quality data and found that on average, not for every single place and every type of doctor, but on average, the VA waiting times were actually lower than the private sector. And a quasi-experimental study found that, if an ambulance happened to take a vet to a VA hospital instead of another hospital, they actually did better if they were brought to the VA hospital using quasi-experimental methodology. So we need to push back very fundamentally on these shibboleths about how the public can't do things well in healthcare. It can, and there are good examples in this country, not only abroad.
I want to say a little bit about taking the step to get to Medicare for all. Now, obviously, no one think we can do that next year. Obviously with the Trump administration, I'm sure we can do it next year. But I mean, let's say we had our dream, Congress president. We can't, we wouldn't be able to do it next year. But a fairly short time, for 4 or 5, 6 years, we could figure out what the transition period would be. We clearly would have to spend more money. But, and I haven't looked at, you might be up to date on the numbers. So what percent of spending now is currently coming from the government? I think it's like 60%.
Yeah, we actually did a study on this where other people have as well. If you tabulate not only Medicare, not only Medicaid, not only the Department of Defense, but you also tabulate the private health insurance premiums of public workers, local, state, and federal. It's a lot of people. And you tabulate the tax exemptions for private health insurance. You get to a figure of about 2/3 of total healthcare spending is already taxpayer financed.
Yeah. So I know you, I'm sure, said this, and your colleagues have said we pay for national healthcare insurance. We just don't get it. Because again, if you look at how much healthcare costs per person, whether it be Canada, Germany, France, we're already paying more. The government, I should be clear, government is paying more per person than what healthcare costs in those countries per person. So we are paying for it. We just don't get it. Now, if we talk about getting from here to there, we've raised this before, obviously you do have to talk about getting additional revenue, but also, to my view, a big chunk of it is getting costs down. And I harp on prescription drugs. So, again, here's where I think we may have an open door. We'll see. I mean, lots of things to worry about at the moment. We'll see where we are, a year, 2, 3 years down the road. But, RFK Jr. says a lot of crazy, crazy things. But he says the pharmaceutical industry is totally corrupt. I think he's pretty much on the spot there. And, one of the, we know people do not like the pharmaceutical industry. That's hardly a secret. And one of the things, and again, I think even a lot of policy people, I know economists, I know they don't appreciate this. I mean, I give these numbers, they look at me like I'm nuts. We'll spend $700 billion this year on prescription drugs and our other pharmaceuticals. I mean, I get that right out of the Bureau of Economic Analysis. It's not a debatable point. If we didn't have government-granted patent monopolies and other protections, which serve a purpose, I'll come back to that in a second. But if we didn't have those, we just said anyone could produce any drug, meeting safety standards, of course, but anyone could produce it, sell it in a free market, just like we get paper plates or shovels or other things that we buy. We'd probably spend a little over $100 billion, because it's very, very rare that prescription drugs are actually expensive to produce and distribute. They're expensive because we give a drug company a patent monopoly, and that allows them to raise the price, oftentimes, 10 times, even 100 times what it would be in a free market. So to my view, I mean, we could save an enormous amount of money by actually having drugs produced, and I'll come to this in a second, being sold in a free market, and having the funding for the research come up front. And again, people look at me, oh, you want the government to? Well, the government already spends, or we used to, I don't know where we'll be after Doge, but we used to spend over $50 billion a year on biomedical research, primarily through NIH, but also some through the CDC and through other pockets. We spent over $50 billion a year on biomedical research. Now, most of that's more basic. We have actually developed some drugs that way, but most of that is more basic. We could say triple that, maybe even quadruple that, and have the research be open research, have it be in the public domain, and certainly save, we could figure out a figure, 300, 400 billion a year on net on prescription drugs, which would make up much of that gap. So if we're looking to, go from paying 2/3 to paying 100%, well, that gets a good chunk of the way, and also, getting to the issue of corruption. We know you create perverse incentives. And again, it drives me nuts with economists, because they all go, oh, you have a 20% tariff wherever we are with Donald Trump these days. They all go, well, that's an invitation to corruption. That's right. Except that when we talk about a patent monopoly for a prescription drug, it's not 20%, it's 1,000%, maybe 2,000, 10,000%. Enormous incentive for corruption. And I don't have to wave my hand and go, oh, imagine this, imagine that. The opioid crisis was exactly that. Purdue Pharma, the other big manufacturers of the new generation of opioids, they lied. They told doctors that they pushed the line that these opioids were not as addictive as prior generation because X, Y, and Z. And they knew that wasn't true. Again, people make honest mistakes. This wasn't an honest mistake. They knew that wasn't true, but they wanted to mass market their new generation of opioids, which they did, and helped create an enormous crisis. So anyhow, I've been blabbing, but I mean, that's, I think a really important way where we could save a lot of money to help pay for, universal national healthcare.
Yeah. And I think, a couple responses. First, getting back to the political point you sort of made at the start of the show about, in a way, the craziness of the current moment potentially opening up doors for doing something better. I think this is a very clear example of that. Trump and RFK Jr. are taking a sledgehammer to our public health infrastructure, which is absolutely awful and should be resisted in every way, shape, and form. But they're going to leave, to some extent, a path of destruction that's going to require us to build back. And it's going to require us to build back. And the question will be, do we want to just go back to the way things were before? Or do we want to envision something better and more robust that takes us beyond where we were in 2020, or whatever? So, the point that I want to make is, first off, echoing yours, which is that, look, RFK Jr. has gotten a lot of sort of, he takes this sort of anti-pharma line, but it's all very thin. At the end of the day, he doesn't actually care about the standards, raising the standards of our drugs, raising the safety and efficacy standards for our drugs. The man doesn't know what those words mean. He thinks ivermectin apparently is a miracle drug. Yeah, he has absolute kooky, cranky nonsense beliefs about any sorts of stuff. So despite the kind of like anti-pharmaceutical rhetoric, if anything, I think, they might like some of his deregulatory positions, although maybe he even goes too far from them. We need to move beyond that. And so I agree with you. You look at the problems right now in pharmaceuticals. I think you can put them in three categories. One is that drugs have to be affordable for patients. Two is that drugs have to be affordable for society, which isn't exactly the same thing. And three is that we want good, high quality, safe drugs that move medicine forward, that we want cures for things we don't have cures for. We don't want to stand still, right? Making drugs affordable for patients in many ways is the easiest. If you had Medicare for all and you covered drugs and you didn't have copays, drugs become affordable for patients. But if you don't change anything else and all you do is cover all drugs, then pharmaceutical companies will just charge whatever they want. Spending will go through the roof and it won't be sustainable. So you do need reforms to make drugs affordable for society, which is why I separate that slightly. And to do that, you can sort of take incremental measures, which matter. I think Biden's sort of Medicare drug negotiations was a step in the right direction, although, modest. You could do that on steroids. You could more aggressively use a single payer to negotiate with drug companies, bring down drug prices, similar to what the VA does for other countries. And I think that would save a lot of money. But I think what you're talking about is going beyond those two options, and I agree with it. The fact is that the NIH has funded the vast majority of the basic science behind our biomedical knowledge, but it doesn't take the final step of the drug of developing the drugs and putting them through clinical trials. We could take that final step, and if we did that, it would have the advantage of not only making drugs available to the world at the cost of production or close to it, but I think it could actually move us forward scientifically, because there's a lot of perverse incentives in the current system. Obviously, pharmaceutical companies have developed crucial life-saving drugs, right? But they've also developed a lot of Me Too drugs. They've developed a lot of drugs that do the exact same thing that 5 of the drugs did before them. They've developed a lot of drugs that don't have good standards for efficacy, or they've set up the trials in ways that really doesn't give us a real good knowledge of, does this actually work? Does it actually extend my life if I have cancer? Or is it simply meeting some sort of surrogate endpoint that doesn't actually translate into better life or longer life? And I think through the kind of reform we're talking about, a new bureau within the NIH that is fundamentally tasked with the development and clinical trials of drugs, or some other system of that sort, could make a world of difference.
Yeah, I could get off too much of this. I just want to make a couple quick points and move on. But, we actually did pay for the development of Moderna's vaccine, which is a great success story. I mean, they developed their COVID vaccine very quickly, and it was a highly effective vaccine. And that was paid for. We paid for a lot of the basic research on RMA technology was paid for through NIH for decades, developing the process. But then actually bringing that to fruition with an effective vaccine, that was literally paid for by the government, including clinical trials. And then we gave Moderna control over it, which, is kind of unbelievable. So they made huge amounts of money on basically our dime. The other point on, again, sticking with COVID vaccines, we actually did, Peter Hotez is very visible on, arguing against RFK Jr., defending medical science. He developed a vaccine which has been widely distributed in India and Indonesia, given to over 100 million people, which has been highly effective against COVID. It costs $2 or $3 a shot. So it's not just, what they charge the person. That's what it costs to produce, manufacture, and distribute it. And that's, I'd love to, we actually did talk to some people about having the FDA approval, and they basically set an impossible barrier that he'd have to do a full clinical trial, even though it had been widely used in these countries, but he'd have to start over, which I won't go into all the details, but basically be incredibly expensive at this point to do a full clinical trial because it involved millions of people. So, but point just being, you can develop drugs through, upfront funding rather than patent monopolies. And as Adam said, you'd very often get better results because you wouldn't have Me Too, you wouldn't have there'd be no incentive to produce a drug just to get in on someone else's patent rights, but B, you could require the knowledge be shared. So Pfizer shares what it has to get a patent. It's not going to invite people in to see all its fundamental research because they'll copy it, so they won't do that for obvious reasons. So I just wanted to get on, again, we're looking at how you pay for it. I won't give my usual diatribe about doctors, but I will say that doctors are more highly paid. That's mostly a question of specialists. And, if we compare doctors in the U.S. with Germany and Canada, it's mostly a story of specialists. But I won't go into that. I don't know how you feel on that one. But I was just going to say that, this is what's really changed my mind and, how quickly we can get to, a universal Medicare system. We saw Trump with his tariffs proposing massive tax increases on ordinary people. And my reason for highlighting that, I'm not in favor of tariffs, they're crazy. But the point was he could put on the table taxes that would hit ordinary working people to the tune of $700-800 billion, maybe even over $1 trillion a year. And I'm saying that I'm not just pulling numbers out of the air because he keeps changing them, so we don't know what he'll end up with. But apparently he thought that made sense. And, he could put taxes on, this is, ordinary working people, a bus driver, a table server in a restaurant. These people will pay those taxes. And he thinks he could get away with that. Well, we've always, and I'm saying we, Democrats, liberals, progressives, however you want to say it, that, okay, we could tax the rich, and I'm for that, but, I'll just say there's only so much we could tax them because, not because I'm sympathetic to them, but you won't get it. They're very good at hiding it. So, we could say, I want to tax Elon Musk 90%. I probably would if you gave me the choice, but he has ways to hide it. We won't get 90%. So, there's only so much money you get by taxing the rich. We do have to, if we're going to have universal Medicare, we're going to have higher taxes on, let's say, the middle class. No one wants to tax someone earning $30,000 a year, but someone earning $80,000, yeah, they could pay higher taxes. And the quid pro quo, of course, is you're getting health care. So, that should be okay. And, my view is, okay, we just saw Trump propose massive tax increases, thousands of dollars a year on a middle class family. Surely we could raise taxes on someone earning $80,000, $500 a year. I haven't tried to calculate, but this is just what, I think we're in a new world in that sense. And we could tell, the people we elect to office that, yeah, we could, if I'm earning $80,000 a year, I could pay an extra $500 a year in taxes, and you're going to pay for my health care.
Yeah. And I would add a couple points to that. So first off, as we discussed earlier, we're sort of already funding. I think when it comes to Medicare for all financing, there's sort of two big questions. We have a pie of healthcare spending. What proportion of that is public? So if we say it's currently about 2/3, about 67%, and let's just say the size of the pie stays the same, then we need to come up with tax revenue to cover that remaining slice, which is a minority, but it's still a lot of money. And so we do need to do that, and that is through taxes. Now, what I would say is that a lot of that is going to be truly invisible to the average person in America. What do I mean by that? Their employers are currently taking money from their paycheck and sending it to United Health. Their employers are currently taking money and sending it to Humana, right? Let us imagine for one moment that instead of that check going to United Healthcare, it goes to the Medicare for All system. The person actually isn't going to even perceive that as a change in their take-home income. It will remain exactly identical. Yet you have now recouped 100% of that private expenditure into the Medicare for All system. So I agree with you. I think that this moment does open up doors to being bold, and to thinking bigger. And I think we have to if we're going to actually push back this juggernaut of Trump. But I think there are ways that you can finance Medicare for all, even assuming the size of the pie stays about the same up front. You can actually find ways to cover that remaining private share of that pie, using tax revenues that really won't directly impact the middle class. Particularly, as I said, using funds going from employers to the government instead of employers to the private insurance companies. And if you want to call that a tax increase, you can. But I think the average person could possibly not care less if they learned that their employer is sending a check to the Medicare for All instead of United Healthcare. No one has sort of brand loyalty to these companies.
That's a safe bet. Yeah, no, that's an incredibly important point. So most of us, most jobs do still provide healthcare. I think it's still most. I'd have to double check, but it's at least a large percentage of jobs, if it's not still a majority of jobs. And for the most part, very few people have any idea of what their employer is paying into their healthcare insurance. So if that check, instead of going to United Health, were going to the government, you won't know. And I don't think anyone would be really upset that, oh my God, it was okay, United Health got my check, but, for my insurance, but I don't want the government to get it.
Especially if you're getting better benefits. Like imagine that's happening at the same time as you're no longer having these deductibles that can be, we haven't talked about it too much, but these out-of-pocket payments are so harmful. I mean, there was a recent study in one of the big economics journals finding that even small copays cause Medicare patients to go without needed medications, and some of them die as a consequence. People are not getting care they need because of these deductibles, copays, and coinsurance. So even if that check doesn't get any smaller, that the employer is currently sending to the healthcare, to United Healthcare, that now goes to the government. If you're getting expanded benefits, that's critically important. And we do need to expand benefits, and that is going to cost money. And it's important to be honest about that. Like, we need a system of long-term care in this country. The current system, whereby if you become disabled and need long-term care, your only real way to go is to spend down all of your assets until you're impoverished so that Medicaid can step in. Is that a good or wise system? It's not. And other countries do have long-term care benefits. And it is expensive, but we can do it.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, I hate to say I'm getting any comfort out of what Donald Trump's doing, but I think he could say, okay, if he could talk about big tax increases to the middle class in order to give big tax cuts to Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, we could talk about smaller tax increases to the middle class to give people good healthcare insurance. That seems to me that we have to have politicians who could sell that.
Absolutely. And I think I do think we're going to need to, shifting gears to the sort of political kind of framing. I mean, what is clear is that people are not happy with the status quo. And I think that if you want to take this country in a new direction, just saying let's wind back the dial a couple of years is not going to turn back Trump and the broader movement that he represents. I do think we need to promise something big and better that's going to help the vast majority of people. And I think that's why healthcare is so critical to this, because it isn't it isn't an important program that only affects a minority of people. It's something that everyone relies on, and that not only for themselves, but their parents and their kids and their grandparents. So I think it's important both from a policy perspective and from a political perspective.
That's great. I think it's a great place to end on. So thanks a lot for joining us on Mostly Economics. As Adam Gaffney, former president of Physicians for a National Healthcare Program and assistant professor at Harvard Medical School. I also should congratulate, I'm very happy to see that Harvard is now standing up to Donald Trump. We'll see where that ends up, but that's good to see. Thanks.
Thanks, Dean.
If you like what you just saw, please help us out by liking us and subscribing. Thank you.